First step in fixing a problem is admitting that you have one. Now, usually I would go with a quote from Yoda, because Yoda's far more my style, but in this case I found the perfect one from Gandhi, which is the confession of errors is like a broom which sweeps away the dirt and leaves the surface brighter and clearer. You may perhaps incur some guilt, as during this talk you recognise some of your own, or more likely your colleagues' bad practices. But remember, you can achieve absolution through remediation. Server and cloud administrators, the people in this room, recognise good practice. We recognise it. Don't always do it, but we know what it looks like. And we don't always get around to putting it in to our production or our development environments. I remember reading something that said, you know, some of us are lucky. We actually have a production environment which we deploy everything to because we don't need a development environment. That's not necessarily going to be the healthiest way to do things, as our friends at Gitlab found a week or so ago. Server and cloud administrators develop bad habits. Now, why do we develop bad habits? Is it because we're flawed individuals? Is it because in the great nature of the universe, no one can but strive for perfection and not reach it? Or is it simply because we practice things like reactive administration? We aren't proactive, we react to problems as they exist. Through a process of natural selection, we have developed what I call an aversion to pulling on loose threads. Who here has ever seen something and they've gone, I could fix it, but I'm worried that in fixing that, I'm actually going to cause 10 more problems? That's good. Remember, this is an interactive session. You can go, yes. Yes, that's what I want to hear. This is like a revival meeting. It's like one of those churches. It's confessional for system. Hallelujah. I'm probably going a bit too far. Okay, Microsoft gives me a lot of rope, often because I want to see if I'm going to hang myself. But the idea being that why not enjoy it? This is the last session of Ignite. Let's have some fun, okay? We've got the keynote later. We probably can't shout too much in the keynote, but no one's going to stop us doing it now. So, who here has an aversion to pulling on loose threads? Yes, excellent. We don't have time. Who has time to do everything they need? Who doesn't have time to do everything they need? Exactly. This is only a test workload for a development environment. It won't ever, ever, ever end up in production. Has anybody been there? Great, we all know where this is going. A consultant set it up. Those bloody consultants. Get jealous. They swan in, they get paid, they set it up, and then it doesn't bloody work. Well, I'm not going to go that far. I already got in trouble about my guinea pig joke. Guinea pig lives matter, do they, Michelle? There was even on my evaluation, I really love my guinea pig and I would take him to the vet. He is not like a Bic lighter. You do read them, yes. Who's ever looked at something when they've gone in and gone, well, it was like that before I got here. Yeah. Exactly. We suspect that our IT infrastructure was built by the professor from Gilligan's Island. And Gilligan's Island is the perfect metaphor for IT, because you are the professor. It doesn't matter what gender you are, because there's always some idiot in a red shirt that destroys your plans. Management keeps prioritising stupid rubbish that stops real people from doing their jobs. Anybody had to deal with management priorities? It's like, literally, let's go and do this. No, there's a fire. No, but we need you to fill out this report about the fire. It isn't paranoia if you have legitimate concerns about the sanity and the competence of your colleagues. There's a beautiful Scott Adams talk where he says, who here would trust someone they worked with to use a Star Trek transporter to transport them anywhere? These are the people who will steal stuff from the staff fridge or leave sandwiches in there until the sandwiches develop their own intelligence and civilization. And you'd trust them to beam you to another planet? No. That's the wonderful... Yeah. The other fictional thing about Star Trek, has anybody ever noticed that when Picard, Kirk, Archer, whoever says open hailing frequencies, the hailing frequency is always open? If it was being realistic, open hailing frequencies. Can you hear me? Is this on? Am I in this meeting? No, I'll reconnect and come back. Now, why is it important to ensure that we do not continue with bad habits? Well, there's actually real reasons, not just funny ones. Security. Security is a great reason. Usually, when we go and we have a bad habit or we have a bit of bad practice, there's usually a reason it's bad practice. And that's not just because someone really likes coming up with compliance regulation to make our life difficult. It's because if you don't use best practice, there's often something that you are missing that is really, really obvious. It also could be cost. Sometimes when we do things, it costs a lot more. This is one of the things that's really interesting about the cloud, because people who don't sit there and plan and don't sit there and worry about exactly how their spend is going to work, go and deploy workloads into the cloud and then get the bill. One of the awesome things about the way that both Microsoft and Amazon offer trial subscriptions is that you go and you put your workload in the cloud and you're firing it up and it's doing everything you want, and that's on the trial subscription, and then you're suddenly thinking, wow, now the trial's expired, now I owe them a lot of money. If you are doing things to best practice, if you are thinking about things, and this is one of the bad habits that people have, especially those of people who are on the developer side of things, they want it just to work as fast as possible, and they're sitting there going, oh, that VM looks nice, a GS5, let's just spin that one up, because everything will run really fast on that in Azure. Then you get the bill. This is what a bad habit is. It's about understanding that you need to look at how you are consuming, for example, cloud resources, and saying, well, this is what we'd love to do, and this is what we can afford to do. Biting, sarcastic observations of your peers. Who's ever shown someone that they work with something that's happened, and then, or had something shown to them, and then tried to hold back a sarcastic response? Because it's not as though anybody who works in this field has a shortage of sarcasm. Some of the worst habits involve things like administrator accounts, and we're going to go through those a little later. And the reason that it's important to get these habits right, for example, with privileged accounts, is that privileged accounts are now the thing that hackers, attackers, and nasty people all over the world are going to go after. Why? Because it's simpler to hack the nerd than it is to hack the infrastructure. Okay? Especially if you're looking at stuff being deployed in the cloud. Okay, it's really difficult to go and attack Azure straight off the bat. But if someone's got a Hotmail account that is used as the root cloud subscription, and you can get the credentials to that, bang, you're in and you've got access to everything. So where's your weakest point of failure? It's often administrator accounts. And in fact, that's what happens now. We see a lot of people actually attack by doing things like going in on LinkedIn, figuring out what the roles are at a particular company, figuring out who the systems administrators are at a particular company, and then just targeting them with phishing emails. And if they're good attackers, they're not going to write the phishing emails where you're sitting there going, this is clearly a trap. Okay? It doesn't take Admiral Akbar to recognise a trap. Sometimes the traps are going to only be obvious after they've closed behind you, and that is when you're in trouble. A large number of very detrimental events in IT occur due to easily preventable things that could have been prevented by good practice. And I'm going to call out Gitlab just because they're the most obvious recent event. So those of you who haven't kept up on the news, Gitlab, in theory, had 6 different forms of data protection set up for their business, which was running in the cloud to protect their customers' data. And then someone went and did something to the database to clean it up. And then they found out that each of those 6 things didn't work, because the bit of good practice that they hadn't done is actually gone and tested whether or not their protection strategies worked. And this is really common, that people go and deploy things in the cloud and to an extent on-prem, and what they do is they go, oh, well, I've set up backup, it must work. Okay, the backup fairy doesn't work like that. The backup fairy needs to go through recovery. It's sort of like an alcoholic, okay? Recover the backup fairy to check that the backup fairy is doing its job, because it's like that guy who you work with who looks like he's doing his job, but unless you check on him, whether or not he's actually doing his job's another matter. Signs of activity don't actually mean signs of productiveness. You don't want to end up in a meeting explaining why you didn't do something obvious. And it's really easy with 20/20 hindsight to look at that when there's a chain of disastrous events and go, yeah, it should have done that. A favourite story I have is about a data centre that was being set up in Darwin. And the people that were setting it up, and this was back probably in the late 90s, didn't necessarily have all that much experience in setting up data centres. So they put the data centre in, and they'd gone, this room gets very hot. Okay, well, we've got to air condition it. So they air condition it. Now, the electrician that was working on the project was fairly new. And he went, okay, we've got this redundant power supply. We've got all of these redundant batteries and things like that. So if the power goes out, the servers are going to keep running. But these servers are going to get really hot. So what the electrician did is plugged all of the air conditioners into the UPS. I don't even have to finish that story because you know what happens. You don't want to end up in that meeting even if they've got really good biscuits. And that's the way you get people to meetings, okay? There's a really good way. If you want to have a meeting with someone, Tim Tams. Just get known as the person that brings really good biscuits to meetings, and people will turn up at your meetings if you want them to. But most of us have an aversion to meetings because, you know, people. You don't want to end up, well, there's a reason we work with computers, right? It's not because we're antisocial, it's just that we're realistic. You don't want to end up with an event which you could have prevented by doing something simple at your workplace becoming a humorous story at Ignite. Because believe me, when something happens that is humorous, we love to share those stories. And it looks funny 10 years later when you're describing it. At the time, not so much. Now, let's talk some bad habits. Googling problems when you're desperate and trying solutions you find in random forum posts on your production environment. Has anybody here ever done that? Making the problem worse by not fully considering all possible outcomes of that solution that you try in desperation that you might not completely understand. Who's tried that? Right, okay, so my advice, don't implement fixes in desperation. No matter how many people are yelling at you, no matter how many C's they have in their title. We have to be careful because this is one of the challenges of the internet. One of the challenges of the internet is that it's sort of made, and you know, those of you who know me know that I write these big textbooks for Microsoft, and they've become a lot less profitable simply because people's approach now to solving problems is I will go and Bing it. Bing! So I will go and Google it, right? I'll go and look in Serverfold. I'll go and look in Stack Overflow. I'll go and look at Reddit. I will go and ask the great hive mind, who we really know is a bit, what the solution to this problem is. And we start with those solutions where we see, I've had this problem, and that looks like the description of the problem I've got, and then there's an answer that's been voted up and said, yes, that works. That's kind of not as bad as the ones where I've got this problem, someone answers it and says, yeah, fix this, and then there's no more responses. And so you're in this indeterminate quantum state of this could work. How desperate am I? Well, I've tried everything else. How many of us have gone, and then about an hour later gone, Pessimism is pragmatism. And what I mean by that is that systems administration and cloud administration is the art of operationalizing pragmatism. Okay, if someone comes to you and says, you're a pessimist. No, you're a realist. Okay, this is the advantage of the job. There are certain jobs where a certain psychology really works well. And if you think that everything's going to be sunny and happy every day and everything is not going to go wrong, and you don't believe in Murphy's Law, you really should not be an administrator. You will be a good administrator if you're the kind of paranoid person, not paranoid, realist. Realist, it could go wrong. My wife's like, why are you so paranoid? If it could go wrong, it might go wrong. My kid could get eaten by a shark on the way to the bus. Though now he's 14, kind of hoping so, but... By the way, parenting technique that I've learnt works really well. Wi-Fi denial. Work out the MAC addresses of each of your kids' devices and then have a script that goes and serially blocks those MAC addresses. So they can see that the Wi-Fi network's there, they're just not getting. And then short DHCP leases as well. Right? You don't have to have the arguments about grounding anybody when you press a button and it's like, why is the Wi-Fi off? Are the dishes done? This is like a gulag. Ooh, 2 weeks of no Wi-Fi. Okay, bad habit. Personal email address used as login account for organisational cloud account. Now, I see this a lot. What happens is that someone spins up a trial subscription in something like Azure or AWS. And because it's a trial subscription, well, what do? They use their personal Hotmail or Outlook or Gmail account to do so. Then they start producing workloads on it. And in some cases, what happens is that they go and have a business expand. And then the business gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and they're still using a personal account as the root account. Because they go and delegate out to other accounts, but, you know, that personal account's still being used. And you'd be surprised how many subscriptions have been taken over when those personal accounts have been breached. Organisational email address used as a login account for an organisational cloud account. That's not so bad. Not so good when you're using an organisational account to sign up for RedTube and Ashley Madison using the same password. Work email often means work credentials, and passwords are increasingly being exposed in data breaches. So we know about this guy. Who here doesn't know this bugger on the jet ski? Okay, this is Troy Hunt. Troy Hunt runs haveibeenpwned.com. He lives on the Gold Coast. He's a regional director like I am and an MVP. What he does is he runs a site so that when a data breach becomes available, he goes and uploads it into Have I Been Pwned, and then if you're a subscriber to Have I Been Pwned, you will be notified if your email address has turned up in a data breach. You can also sign up as an organisation to Have I Been Pwned, so that if anybody in your organisational email domain turns up in a data breach, you'll get notified. So that's sort of like the business option. I thoroughly recommend that you do this, because who here trusts their users enough to believe that they would never, ever, 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 ever sign up to a site that had pictures of people without clothes on using their work address? Does everybody trust their users enough? No. There's .mil accounts turn up in these breaches. So I'm a military person. I'll sign up for porn. I had a wonderful question in New Zealand when I was talking about this. One of the people sitting in the front row said, "What's RedTube?" And I had to come back and say, basically, an educational site for 14-year-old boys. Multiple administrators using a single highly privileged account to manage the cloud subscription. I've seen this a lot, that you go to an organisation and you say, okay, I want to go and have a look at your cloud deployment. And they've got one account, and everybody uses that account. So anybody can go and blow away a VM that's running. Anybody can go and blow away a database that's running. The account has a simple password, often the organisation's name with 123 after it. Don't do that. When you're setting up a cloud account, have a very specific account that's the root account. Have it with a nasty-looking GUID password. And then only use that account to delegate rights out to other accounts that are used to actually perform specific tasks. This is your in case of awful event, break glass account. That's the only time that root account. If your organisation has a cloud deployment and there's only one account that everybody's using, that's not good practice. That's crazy stuff. Not enabling two-factor authentication on privileged cloud management accounts. Okay, so that's super special account, turn on 2FA. It might be that if someone uses it, they've got to get a phone call, they've got to type in a PIN code to go and use it. Now, there's some situations where you can't use 2FA to perform certain tasks. For example, with Azure PowerShell, if you're interacting with Azure. Well, what you do is you delegate out what you need, the rights that you need that account to have, to a separate account, and then you limit what that account can do because you know that it can't be used with two-factor authentication. Keeping username and passwords for all privileged and on-premises account in a single password-protected Word doc or Excel spreadsheet is not good practice. Who here has something like that or knows someone who's got something like that? Yeah, okay. This is bad. It's not great to use something like LastPass or so on to do it, but have a situation. There are even good products like Enterprise Random Password Manager that are designed to manage enterprise passwords. But don't try and use a solution like an Evernote document or a OneNote document where you've just got one password. Because what happens is each one of these, the Excel document or the Word document, has a single password, right? And if one person knows it, two people knows it, well, the probability of more people than two knowing it, and especially if it doesn't get changed, and then suddenly a few years later, everybody knows it. Not using role-based access control on cloud subscriptions. Now, role-based access control is basically where you say, this is what you can do. For example, you have the permission to go and start and stop VMs. You have the permission to basically go and scale out PaaS websites. But you don't allow someone to go and do everything. You have separate accounts. So if someone wants to go and use that tool, they need a specific account to do that tool. Yes, it's inconvenient, but it also means that it's more secure, because should that account get compromised, what can be done with that account is limited. Not using privileged identity management, specifically with Azure, which is an implementation that Azure has for basically locking down your Azure admin accounts. So, Azure Privileged Access Management. Certain accounts can request elevated privileges for a specific amount of time. Literally, it requires two-factor authentication. So, what happens is you say, I want to go and do this. I want to go and create 10 virtual machines. It then rings you. You've got to put in a code, and for the next 30 minutes, you can go and do that task. And then after 30 minutes, you can't do it. By ringing you, by going and contacting a phone that you know that you own, then it's certain that it's not some bloke who's sitting in a cafe in Kiev who's decided to get himself some Bitcoin at your expense. Not applying software updates to IaaS VMs. Okay, this is one that people forget. When you go and deploy a virtual machine in the cloud, the moment you deploy it, it becomes your responsibility. Okay, it's like when you get a puppy or when you get a guinea pig. Okay, so let's pretend that we're taking the guinea pig to get its vaccinations every month. Okay, you've got to vaccinate your VMs. You've got to make sure that those things are updated. Can't tell you how many clients I've looked at where you log on to the VM and they're like, when did you last update this? Oh, I thought the cloud provider did that. No, this is the trick, okay? So if you're ever sitting there worried about where your career goes as an IT pro with the cloud, there's all of these things that the cloud provider doesn't do that someone like an ops person for the cloud needs to know about, because there's all of these misconceptions about what the cloud provider does and what the cloud provider doesn't do. And often, and I'm not saying that this is, well, in part it's deliberate, right? Because no cloud provider wants to provide you with a disincentive to use their product. So what they make it look like is it's all cake, right? That there is no Brussels sprouts, that you come to the cloud and it's all cakes and you don't have to eat any Brussels sprouts. And people are like, awesome. I did an interview with Seth Juarez earlier in the week, where he was basically saying, well, what's the role for IT pros in the cloud? And I'm saying, well, basically, they've got to know all the stuff about the cloud that the developers are ignoring. And I got an email, a Twitter back saying, show me on the doll where the developer touched you. Because I was basically saying, guys, it's not all unicorns and rainbows. There's a whole lot of stuff you've got to know about compliance, about software updates, about what the cloud provider's responsible for and what the cloud provider's not responsible for. And when it comes down to what the cloud provider's not responsible for, that's in those little terms and conditions which we, as systems administrators, are basically anal retentive enough to actually read. Some of us are not, but I'm guessing most of the people in this room kind of are. Leaving VMs running in Azure. Now, orphaned VMs are a big problem on-prem and in the cloud, because what people do is that they go and spin up a VM and they go, oh, okay. And the VM just keeps running and running, and when it's running, it's dollars, 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 okay? The idea, the thing that you need to remember about the cloud is that when stuff's deployed in the cloud, it's working very much on that model of you only run it when you need it. And when you don't need it, what you do is you shut it down and then deallocate it. Because even if it's allocated, what happens, especially in Azure, is that it still retains basically a lease on a particular processor and a bit of particular hardware. And because you've got a lease on that hardware and Microsoft can't assign it to anybody else, well, they're going to go and charge you for it. So there's people going, well, I shut down my VMs. Why is it still costing me this much money? Well, because Microsoft can't go and redeploy that hardware until you deallocate the virtual machine. And people don't understand this. It can even be that, if you've got certain activity going on, I had a friend who was talking about one of their systems where there was a particular task that was running and thrashing the disk in the middle of the night on one of their VMs in Azure. And it was costing them a whole lot of money. You know, it was costing them a couple of $100 a month because they had so many VMs on which this task was running. So be aware that it works really well, but at a certain point in time, if you need to leave a machine on all the time, then go back and look at the economics of whether or not you should be running that in the cloud or on your on-prem data center. Because it might be that, you know, if you want insane computing power for a very short amount of time, cloud's the way to go. If you want insane computing power all the time, probably cheaper to go and buy the hardware and do it yourself. Orphaned VMs. So orphaned VMs and orphaned workloads are a huge problem. There's a lot of organisations, especially big organisations where teams don't necessarily talk to one another, where people go and throw something up in the cloud and then they don't need it anymore because it's not in production, but they don't go and tell anybody about it. And we see that there's apparently 30% of VMs running in all data centres are actually not doing anything whatsoever because people have simply deployed the workload and at some point the project's finished or whatever, and they haven't gone and told anybody to have that workload deprovisioned and removed. You need a process within your organisation to end-of-life workloads so that you know that you can get rid of that workload, okay? So a lot of people, for example, that were pulling Server 2003 out of their environment were finding that a large number of those Server 2003 servers actually weren't doing anything. They were just sitting there because no one told the responsible parties that they actually had to go and get rid of, you know, that it was no longer needed. Make sure that you have a process by which you can monitor those workloads to see if they're being used, and if they're not being used, think about getting rid of them. So clean up your resources in subscriptions because your organisation's still paying for it. If someone's left a website running on a VM in your data centre, that's not a problem. If someone's left a VM, a website running in Azure or AWS, you're paying for that website, whether or not anybody's using it or not. Not having a backup or DR strategy for your organisation's cloud workload. This is a really big one. Okay, so I just talked about Gitlab. But the number of organisations that just assume that if I deploy it in the cloud, Microsoft or Amazon or whoever's going to look after it in terms of backup and recovery is amazing. Now, each of these services do offer a backup service, but you've got to go and set it up. And if you're not sitting there thinking, is this getting backed up? Or you're not prone to thinking that way, and there's a lot of people who are like, oh, I just want to get it up. I'm not going to worry about that. Well, at some point, you've got to go through and make sure that all of these workloads are being backed up. And, for example, if corruption occurs, can you recover it? And actually know how to recover a workload in the cloud. How do you do that? Do you just override it from on-prem? Do you have a strategy for that? So you go in, you figure it out, you document it. Not disabling, okay, so this is very specific for Azure IaaS. RDP PowerShell SSH access from any IP address to the internet into an infrastructure as a service VM. So when you go and deploy a VM in Azure, what happens is it turns on RDP access for everybody in the world. And you can go in and RDP to that. And people go, cool. Do you really want to have someone sitting in that cafe in Kiev being able to RDP into your virtual machine running on Azure? No. So what you need to do is you need to basically lock it down so that access only occurs from specific locations, either the IP addresses that you're coming from or you set up a VPN. Come up with an administrative model so that you're not administering stuff over the internet. You're coming in a secure manner, and so that people on the internet can't make those connections, because there will be someone who does a port scan or whatever, or has an automated tool and just keeps hammering your machine trying to get in. And unless your passwords are really good, at some point, what's going to happen? Neglected event logs. Now, I ask this every year. Whose approach to Event Viewer is to open it, look at it, go, no red ones, couple of yellow ones, clear, done for the day? Yes! Event logs shouldn't be neglected, but the problem is, how do you analyse all of that data? Most breaches have involved months and months of network reconnaissance, and this is what happens. If there's a big breach, then they go back through the logs and they go, well, actually, if we knew what we were looking for, we'd have been able to see that. Hostile activity, for example, was present in the target breach log. So the target breach is the one, I talked about it in other talks, but basically what happened is the US target had all of these registers, and basically what happened is some attackers were able to put malware on those registers by infecting an image deployment server, so that every day when the image was refreshed, the malware was dropped back on the servers. And what had happened was that when they went and looked in the logs, they found that 6 months before, the attackers had got in, and then they just reconned the network. And that was all in the logs, but they didn't have the ability to go through the logs and find that activity. So sometimes administrators ignored breaches as false positives, certainly in the target case. Now, what you need to do is you need to understand what you need to respond to, and you need to understand the difference between suspicious and anomalous. And this is really difficult without having a lot of intelligence about what's going on. And if you go and look at certain parts of the internet, they'll tell you this. However, there is another solution. There's a product called Advanced Threat Analytics, which is a Microsoft product, obviously, that what it does is it basically uses machine learning to go through your logs and to figure out if there's activity in your logs that is anomalous. So it has that deep learning understanding, and it has the ability, because it's an AI, to basically go through and find the stuff that you don't know that you don't know. Or you can have a product from another vendor which will go and help you with that. But you need an automated way. We are in no way living in a society or no way living in a digital environment where we manage, where we can literally have the time to sit there and go through each event and go, I'm like Sherlock Holmes. That looks suspicious. That looks suspicious. Well, Watson, we've got a hacker. Or if it's, Benedict Cumberbatch, you'd have all of these, Watson, the game is afoot. Sorry, Dormammu, I've come to bargain. Okay. Service accounts, on-premises and in IAMS VMs. People setting up service accounts. So who here has managed service accounts? Who here enjoys managing service accounts? No. Okay. Who here has ever set a service account password to never expire? Who here has used a single service account for all services? So, some of you. Service accounts all using the same password. Anybody know that one? Like service account password that is configured to never expire, that everybody in the organisation knows. Service accounts added to the local administrators group. Who here's done that? No, who here's got a colleague that's done that? I love how you guys will throw any colleague under the bus. Then again, given what my workmates were like, buses are good. Who's ever seen a service account that's a member of the domain admins group? Do the hard work and make service account least privilege work. Also, investigate a group-managed service account. Group-managed service accounts have been around since Server 2008. The idea of them is that basically you set them up and Active Directory manages the service account password. It rotates them, and pretty much every product released by Microsoft and most products released by third-party vendors in the last 7 years support group-managed service accounts. You set them up, you install them on each machine, and because no one here has Server 2003, I hope, do they? No. Well, at least you're not running like I heard of one. I've been to places where you look in and they're running bloody Windows NT4. Well, that's why Windsor's still around, isn't it? To make all of those NT4 boxes still work. I tried to explain to someone, I said, look, my son is my height. He wasn't born when Windows XP came out. Maybe it's time to retire that. Bad password management for practices for service accounts is not unique as a password management problem, but you can solve it. Now, cloud and on-premises administrator account passwords that are configured to expire and never change. Well, you need to, at least with your cloud administrator account, make sure that you either make it an insanely difficult password or you change it. Now, there was some recent research that was published by Microsoft Research that said, you know, maybe we shouldn't force people to change their passwords at all. We get them to do a really big, complex password, and we keep it at that. There's a certain amount of logic to that. You are going to have to find what works in your environment. What you do want to avoid is if you go and put password policies in place that make people change them too often, then you end up with, you know, post-it notes with passwords on them. So if people are being forced to change them, also teach them techniques that they can use to actually retrieve those passwords and use those passwords. And we're getting better with that. We're seeing things more and more like, Windows Hello, which allows us to log on using other technologies. Now, what you need to do is, at least with your on-prem environment, go and search for accounts that have got non-expiring passwords. And I like to say that this is the best way of finding out who's got an administrator account. Because if there's one thing administrators do, is it makes every other user in the organisation change their password every 41 days. But bug it if they're going to do it. In some organisations, every default local administrator account on every workstation and server in the organisation has the same password. Who here knows of an organisation where that's the case? Yeah. Okay, there's a solution. It's called Local Administrator Password Solution. It's a freely downloadable thing from Microsoft. What it does is it goes out and sets an individual password on each domain joined machine. If you need to log on to that machine, you go and query LAPS and it will give you the complex password for that machine. Each machine has an individual password. If you don't do this, believe you me, your users know the default administrator password for their machine, they just don't tell you that they know it. So every time that IT's not looking and they want to go and install something, they log back in as local administrator and they go and do it. And if you think that your users aren't smart enough to do that, you're kidding yourself. And remember that not only are millennials entering the workforce, you've got people like my 14-year-old who in a couple of years is going to graduate university. He was born in 2002. What do you think his computer literacy is like? Right? So the average age of an IT pro is mid-40s. Okay? Most of us got into the industry when most of the people we were working with were older than us. Most of the people we were working with had lower levels of computer literacy than us, sometimes substantially lower. As we have got older, we've seen a shift. We're seeing more computer literate people come in. Certainly not people that, like us, had to actually figure out how to get autoexec.bat and config.sys set up so that we could actually play Quake. And who learnt networking just to get Duke Nukem working on the LAN. And if you're listening to everybody that's agreeing with that, you understand my point about the average age of an administrator being in their 40s. Okay, so one of the challenges that you're dealing with on-prem, one of the challenges you're dealing with is you're getting a new generation of computer literate people, and how we deal with computer literate users is very different from how we've learnt to deal with users when we started out on the service desk. Now, this is something else that you need to think about in terms of your own administrative practice, whether or not you're administering workloads in the cloud or workloads on-prem. And that is that any device that you use to directly interact with the web and email is a possible vector for malware. Remember my thing, infect the administrator, get access to the infrastructure. Hack the nerd is simpler than hacking the system. And you didn't see that in the 90s version of hackers. You know, hack the planet. No, just hack the nerd. If you use a device to interact with the internet on a casual basis, don't use that device to manage systems. So this is what's called the privileged access workstation approach. If your day-to-day account, okay, who here works with someone whose day-to-day account is a member of the local admins group? Oh, it got very quiet now, didn't we? Don't know anybody that does that. Log onto your machine and like Barry's a member of local admins. Who's Barry? If you're really smart, what you do is you make your local admin account that you don't talk about, the name of your colleague, so that they get blamed when you get audited. Or someone who's left. Well, I didn't set it up, it was Tim. Tim's at Google now. Who knows of anybody that's disabled UAC because it's an... Hack the admin is much easier if the admin always logs on as an admin and disables UAC. Oh, look, I'll run that. Who here's gone and downloaded something from SourceForge and gone, this must be safe. I'll install this. I need it to do my job. Yeah, it's funny how we trust people on the internet. Oh, that person looks like they've got a solution to my problem. It must work. If I really wanted to cause problems, I'd just be posting evil answers on all of those things. Which I don't understand why it doesn't happen more often, given that, if there was a class of people that was likely to end up as supervillains, it's IT operations personnel. Just an observation. Don't use a domain admin account to sign on to a local workstation. Who's got a colleague who does that? Only use privileged accounts on a limited number of computers. So this is called a privileged access workstation. And the way you can set one up, so we know with Windows 10 we've got a thing called Device Guard and Credential Guard. Device Guard allows us to limit which software runs on the machine. You lock the machine down so it's only authorized administrator tools. Then you configure all of your servers to only allow access from those machines. You can even do the same thing with your cloud account, so that your cloud account only allows administration for certain machines. I am timing this so that you will get to lunch at 1 o'clock, by the way, just because I know food's very important for systems administrators. Well, also, you've got an hour for lunch and then we've got the lock note. So look, I'm very cognizant of all of that. Now, the reason that you go and use that is that there's a new attack that's becoming very common. Who here knows of Mimikatz? Okay, so those of you who don't know, Mimikatz is a utility that you can download for free that basically what it'll do is it'll pull all of the local password hashes of anybody who's logged onto that machine that are still being cached. So it's an extraordinary attack because you can then use it to spider across the network. And until Microsoft came up with Credential Guard, there was no real effective defense against Mimikatz. And what Credential Guard does is it basically stores cached credentials in a virtual container so that applications can't access that because of all the security built into the operating system. But until they did that, if you're running Windows 7, Windows 8, or even Windows 10 without Credential Guard enabled, it's possible to run Mimikatz and then go and pull that thing. I suggest, just for your own edification, that you spin up a VM and that you explore what Mimikatz can do so that you have an understanding of what you're up against. Okay? 15 years ago, 20 years ago, malware was written by script kiddies or by kids in their basement or whatever. Analysis of current malware is showing that they're basically using the same industrial software development techniques that you would see out of a high-end startup or an established company. They're checking code in, they're revising code, they're updating it. We're not talking little people anymore or individual lone actors. We are talking either, in some cases, we're talking about states that have set up deniable organisations to go and generate this stuff, or we're talking about organisations that have figured out how to make a lot of money. The amount of money that has come out of ransomware is now measured in the billions of dollars. So this is a billion-dollar industry. Someone found out how to monetize the internet by locking up your files and asking you to bloody send them some cash in Bitcoin. Who here's ever had to deal with a ransomware infection? Right, okay, so now you're seeing why this is getting important. Okay, you need to have ways, and Device Guard is the other part of that puzzle. Device Guard basically says unless the application's authorized, don't allow it to run. Because what we're getting now is we can't live in that age where we could just download anything from the internet and hope that it wasn't infected. Because we don't know if stuff infected. If infected stuff is getting into Google's App Store, what chance have you got if you're just downloading it off a website that even if the website's got an SSL certificate, you're trusting, you don't know what they're putting up there. So, as I said, the solutions are basically to turn on Credential Guard. Now, restrict your privileged accounts. Basically specify that your privileged accounts can only be used on certain machines. And you can do this in Active Directory users and computers. You can literally go in and say, right, this domain admin account can only be used on these 5 computers. If someone tries to log in otherwise, they just won't be authenticated to log in. And this functionality has been there forever, just that people don't turn it on because it makes things inconvenient. Not only can you restrict which machines an account can be used on, you can configure when it can be used. So again, you have your, in case of, the 3 o'clock in the morning account, but the accounts that are used on a day-to-day basis, well, what you do is you set it so that they can only be used during business hours. Because attackers that are coming into your network often act at times when no one's meant to be around. So 3 in the morning is when that sort of account would be used. And if you went and looked at the properties of accounts, or you had a way of auditing that, and you suddenly saw an account modified so that it would work at 3 in the morning, you'd be a bit concerned about the security of that account. Don't have Swiss Army knife admin accounts. And a Swiss Army knife admin account is an account that's got permissions to, say, the SQL Server, Configuration Manager, Exchange, and Azure. Who here has a colleague who has a Swiss Army knife account? Okay, what you need to do is you need to tear that Band-Aid off. You need to have separate accounts for all of those things. If someone gets access to an account, and you assume that they will at some point, minimise what damage that they can do. Don't even have it as a full SQL Server administrator account. You use role-based access control to make sure it can only do X, Y, and Z. You need to do A, B, and C. Well, you go and get another account and you go and do that. Inconvenient, yes, but it's a lot more secure. Don't have master keys, okay? Don't give everybody a master key. Everybody's got if you are lucky enough to work in an environment where people actually have offices instead of sort of that 1984 dystopian cubicle or open plan, which, if George Orwell had known about open plan, he would have written about that. Should all the accounts in your domain admins group actually be there? Who's going to positively answer yes? Who's going to positively answer or negatively answer no? No. Some of you are sitting there thinking about it going, maybe. Do I want to look? Eventually, and there's a model called admin-free Active Directory, and you can actually move to the point where you've delegated roles out so that there's no one sitting in the domain admins group. You can go and read about admin-free Active Directory on Microsoft's website. And I talked a little bit about the trusted forest approach, where basically you have all of the accounts that are used for administrative things as standard user accounts in a resource forest, in an admin forest, and then in the production forest, those accounts are sitting there. But you can only get an account that's got administrative privileges in your production forest by adding it in the forest that no one can log into, except for one person. Does your organisation have an account lockout policy for administrators? Does anybody have that in place? Does anybody not have it in place? Yeah, know of someone. If an admin account incorrectly authenticates 3 times, probably best to lock it out and require a manual unlock. Again, another story from my own experience. I used to work with a guy. So when I first got my job, this is actually back in probably about mid-2000 or so, I just got the job as a network administrator at a company. And I had domain admin access and he did not. And he'd managed to lock his account out. And he came to me and I was on a phone call and he said, "Oh, can you reset my password because I've locked myself out?" I said, "Yeah." Anyway, finished the phone call 20 minutes later and then went to go and find me. He said, "Oh, don't worry about it." I said, "Why not?" "No, don't worry about it." "Oh, you know the guy who had the job before you?" "Yeah." "Oh, I remembered his password and I logged in using his account and reset my own." If you can work out what's wrong with that, you've got your own case study. Now, just-in-time privileged access management I talked about yesterday. Basically, this is the idea that administrative privileges should only exist for a short amount of time, that basically you should request them, and what you can do with an account is limited by a set of PowerShell commandlets. Disabled Windows Firewall. Who here has had a colleague, when setting up an application on a server and it doesn't work, has gone, "You know what? It won't hurt if I open Windows Firewall with Advanced Security, right-click on it, go Properties, go to Domain Profile, Disable, Private Profile, Disable, Public Profile, Disable. Okay. Anybody know anybody that might have done that? It's easier to turn it off than it is to figure out how to create the rules. It's actually fairly simple to figure out how to create the rules. You turn on logging and you see what it's logging as dropping packets, and then you go, oh, okay, port 772. Probably need to open that one. GUIs on servers that don't need GUIs. Okay, so this is a big push by Microsoft. Go and remove GUIs from servers. Go and deploy Server Core as your first option and remotely manage the server. Okay, you're all probably managing a large number of servers now. You don't RDP across to each server anymore. You use management tools to do fan-out administration where you administer a lot of servers from one console. Use that methodology. You don't need RDP on there, you don't need a GUI on there, get rid of it. Because in doing so, you're reducing the attack surface there. You're certainly minimizing the chance that another person that you work with is going to log onto that server and they're doing something and they get bored and then they open Internet Explorer and suddenly they're on Reddit and they're suddenly infected the server with things. And there's so many servers that get infected that way. Literally people that are bored in the data center firing up a browser and then they're pwned. You can use Nano Server as well. Nano Server is a new installation option for Windows Server 2016. It's basically what you do is you build the Nano Server and you say, this is going to be a file server, and that's all it can do. You can't add roles to it post-haste. It's going to be a file server for its entire lifetime. If you want it to do something else, what you do is you go and build another Nano Server and deploy that instead. It's really, really small. It's like 400 meg in size. Really, really quick to deploy, but you have to build the server purpose-built. It's not like the current model of Windows Server or the past model of Windows Server where you literally go and deploy a server and then decide what it's going to be. You decide what it's going to be first, you configure it to have those roles, and you deploy it rather than deploying it and then going, oh, you know what? I want to add this, add web server to this. I want to add file server to this. I want to make it a remote access server, which you can do currently. In doing that, you are limiting what that server can do. You're making it just a component that does all it should do. Expiring CA certificates. Who here has ever dealt with an expiring CA certificate that no one told them about? Okay, you need to have a process in place. I mean, once it happens to you, you know, and you're not going to let it happen again. But there's so many organisations that went and deployed Active Directory certificate services and then forgot that they needed to manually update the CA certificate. So suddenly one day everybody comes into work and none of their certificates work. That's not a good day. Being less than diligent about applying software updates to applications except for when trying to resolve an issue. So who here has a colleague who once they deploy an application never applies software updates until they actually hit a problem with that application? And I'm not talking about applications in terms of web applications. I'm talking about stuff like maybe Exchange or SQL Server or a third-party product. They're like, oh, the backup product works. I'm not going to patch it because it works. Anybody got a colleague who does that? Okay, you need to keep your applications up to date. They're, again, part of the attack chain that can be used to compromise your systems. Lack of recovery drills. Who here has had a recovery drill in the last 3 months? Who here feels that they should have had a recovery drill in the last 3 months? Right, make sure you do it, because a recovery drill will tell you where things fall down. And what you need to do is you need to make them as nasty as possible, because when you're in the situation where you are actually recovering after a disaster, that's when everybody's going to be running around and screaming like their head's on fire, and they're not necessarily going to be able to behave rationally. If you know all the detail that you need to go through to recover, you're going to be fine. That's why people, for example, the fire department at an airport is constantly drilling on what to do if an airplane crashes. Because in that situation, they shouldn't be sitting there reading the manual going, okay, airplane's crashed, what do? We turn on the fire engine. If you don't know that your data is protected until you verify that you can actually go and recover it. And that's just a truism, right? You don't know, and Gitlab certainly learnt that, didn't they? They learnt that they weren't as protected as they thought they were because they weren't doing recovery drills on it. Especially if you've got stuff in the cloud. I want you to imagine, if you've got a lot of stuff deployed in the cloud, ask yourself what would happen if your cloud subscription was accidentally deleted tomorrow? Could you recover, or are you completely stuffed? The answer should not be, if you've got a business and your livelihood depends on it, that you're completely stuffed. Literally have that as your scenario. How do you come back from our cloud subscription accidentally got deleted to we've got a production, we're basically back online as a business? That's what you need to be able to recover from. Lack of administrator auditing. Quis custodiet ipsos custodes, which is who watches the watchers. You need to be audited yourself, because not only could your colleague be evil, or just really stupid, which could be the same thing. It could be that your colleague's account gets hacked, because of course they're signing into all of those sites that are educational for 14-year-olds. Unwillingness to document. Now, this has always worked. This is the basis of my career, is the unwillingness of systems administrators to document. I write systems administration textbooks because pretty much everybody in this room, when confronted with a Word page and asked to document something, goes, you know what, I'd like to go to the dentist instead. Lack of configuration documentation. What's it look like? What's it meant to look like? If you got hit by a bus tomorrow, could the people that you work with, assuming that they're as smart as you, actually rebuild it? So part of that recover from a cloud deletion event is, what are the steps that I need to rebuild this business? Have it documented so that someone who is not as brilliant as you could actually do it. Lack of change documentation. If you make a change, document it. If it varies from your configuration documentation, it needs to be written down somewhere. There is nothing as bad as going and rebuilding a server and then not having it work because someone didn't write down the next step, which was, oh, you needed to go and do this, because we found out, 3 months down the track that this actually made it work. Ensure that your environment is as documented so it is comprehensible. Okay? Never allow the only people that understand your environment to have that knowledge locked up in here. Move towards configuration management, such as desired state configuration or Chef. And there's a really cool demo that you can do. There's a thing called Autolab that you can get on GitHub. And this is an excellent demonstration of how awesome desired state configuration is. Because what you do is you run one PowerShell script and it reaches up, it downloads the eval version of Windows Server, it pulls it down, it actually then creates a network with 5 virtual machines on it, including a domain controller and 4 member servers, just by running a script. It pulls down the ISO, it builds some virtual hard disks, it then basically injects desired state configuration into those hard disks. And you come back an hour later and you've got a lab. And we use that at Pluralsight for our students. So if someone wants to basically follow along with the lab that we're doing a course on, they all have to do is run a script and have it connected to the internet and be willing to download the ISO. And then they've got a lab an hour later that's fully configured with domain controllers and everything. Comatose virtual machines we've talked about. Comatose PaaS deployments. Make sure that if you've got something in the cloud that someone's actually using it. Monitor stuff. Use OMS to go in and check that these things are actually responding, that they're being used. If it's not being used, decide what to do with it. But don't leave it there incurring charges. Search for accounts that haven't signed on for 90 days. Who here, well, I'm not going to ask. There will be accounts in your environment that no one's using. Have a process to get rid of those accounts, to recognize them and disable them. And then if they've been inactive, if you disable an account and it hasn't logged on for 90 days, and you don't hear anything for another 90 days, probably a fair bet that account's not being used anymore, because you've gone almost a year without anybody screaming about it. The solution is always tear off the Band-Aid, disable the account, shut down the unused server or VM and see what happens. Do something and respond to the screams. Or in polite company, we call this Devops. Aspire to be proactive rather than reactive. The vast majority of security breaches could have been prevented by good practice. The professor could have escaped Gilligan's Island if he only had Troy Hunt's jet ski. Good administrative practice will save your organisation money and in the long term, and reduce the chance of your own resume refreshing event. Please fill out a session evaluation. You could win a jet ski ride if you're Troy Hunt. I'm happy to take questions. Okay, if you haven't got any questions, or if you do, just come up and ask me. Otherwise, thank you very much for your attention.